military radar operator listened in horror as a completely empty airplane described their own autopsy in clinical detail. At first, I thought it was a sick joke. The late shift at the coastal monitoring station was notorious for radio bleed-over from the mainland. I tapped the headset, adjusting the squelch dial to filter out the static. But the voice didn't fade. It just became sharper, colder, and agonizingly precise. The voice was devoid of human inflection, calmly stating that the primary incision had bypassed the sternum and was now separating the thoracic plating. I stared at the green sweep of the radar, watching the blip hold a steady altitude of 30,000 feet. There was no pilot on board, no crew, not even a pressurized cabin. It was a fully automated cargo drone, returning from a routine supply drop over the Pacific. My supervisor, Lieutenant Harris, leaned over my console and chuckled, claiming it was just a crossed frequency from a local medical college. He told me the ionosphere was bouncing signals again, a common glitch during solar storms. I wanted to believe him. It was a comforting, boring explanation that made the cold sweat on my neck feel foolish. But the transponder code blinking on my screen didn't belong to a medical frequency. Just listen. The broadcast continued, the voice now describing the severing of the hydraulic lines as if they were major arteries. It detailed the exact pressure drop, the pooling of synthetic fluids in the lower fuselage, and the sensation of cold air entering the exposed cavity. I frantically cross-referenced the telemetry data pouring into the secondary monitor. The drone's internal sensors were green across the board. According to the mechanics, the plane was in perfect condition. The cognitive dissonance was physically painful. I was looking at a screen that said the aircraft was structurally sound, while listening to it narrate its own systematic dismantling. The voice paused to take wet, rattling breaths, a biological impossibility for a machine. It noted that the ribs had been fully retracted, exposing the core. Then, through the static, I heard the distinct, unmistakable sound of a metal scalpel dragging across aluminum. The sound was so loud, it made my teeth ache, echoing through the headset with horrifying clarity. Harris stopped laughing. He grabbed the emergency comms, screaming at the base commander to scramble interceptors. But the radio only returned the sound of a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat. That was when the radar blip did something physically impossible. It didn't just drop in altitude or lose speed. The solid green dot fractured into a dozen smaller biological-like clusters that continued flying in perfect formation at Mach 1. The telemetry data screamed in protest, throwing up error codes I had never seen before. Total system failure. The crisp green lines of my monitor dissolved into a mess of thermal noise and corrupted data blocks. I watched in paralyzed silence as the fragmented blips slowly merged back together, reforming the shape of a single aircraft. The voice on the radio let out a long, shuddering sigh. It announced in a chillingly satisfied tone that the extraction was complete. The radio went dead, replaced by the standard automated hum of the drone's navigation beacon. Flight 71 began its descent, touching down on the primary airstrip exactly on schedule. It executed a flawless automated landing, the tires screeching against the tarmac as if nothing had happened. Base security teams surrounded the aircraft before the engines even spun down. I watched through the long-range thermal cameras, expecting the fuselage to be a mangled, hollowed-out shell. Their spotlights cut through the thick coastal fog, illuminating the drone's exterior. The thermal signature was completely normal. The plane was entirely intact, without a single scratch on its aluminum skin. A heavily armored inspection team approached the cargo doors, their movements hesitant and jerky in the thermal feed. They pried the latch open, the heavy metal groaning under the pressure. I held my breath, waiting for whatever had performed the surgery to spill out onto the tarmac. But as the doors swung wide, the thermal feed showed absolutely nothing inside. The cargo hold was completely empty. There was no blood, no severed wires, no missing components, just bare metal and the faint smell of ozone. The base was locked down, the incident classified and buried before the sun even came up. We were told it was a highly sophisticated cyber attack, a phantom signal designed to test our response times. But I was the one who pulled the black box from the cockpit the next morning. The flight recorder didn't contain telemetry data, wind speeds, or error logs. It held exactly 40 hours of pristine audio detailing a human autopsy. The subject's name was Lieutenant Harris, and the date of death was recorded as exactly 3 years from today. Interrogation Room 4 was designated for a routine audit, but the air inside held a sharp, metallic tang of ozone that shouldn't have existed in a sealed facility. Employee Miller sat beneath the harsh, flickering glare of the overheads, his wrists chafed by steel cuffs, waiting for the data packet to initialize. The CCTV feed was pristine, a high-definition window into a standard security protocol, until the light began to bend. Then, the reflection in the two-way mirror began to drift, shedding its synchronization like a poorly rendered texture. Miller scratched his chin, and the reflection waited half a second before mimicking the motion, a delay that felt like a tear in the fabric of the room. It was a rhythmic, nauseating lag, the kind of digital desynchronization we usually see when the local server cache is overloaded by an unauthorized data stream. I checked the buffer status on my console, but the system reported nominal operations, leaving the discrepancy to fester in the silence of the room. Miller froze, his eyes darting toward the glass as he caught the stutter in his own image. He raised his right hand, splaying his fingers against the air, testing the boundary between his reality and the cold, unyielding surface of the image. The reflection did not react to the movement, remaining motionless for 3 agonizing seconds while its eyes locked onto Miller with a predatory, calculated intensity that turned the room's oxygen into ice. Miller's breathing hitched, his skin turning a sickly, translucent gray as the air in the room grew heavy and stagnant. The reflection dropped its hand, while Miller's remained suspended, a living statue caught in the mirror's distorted gravity. The image in the glass reached into its own pocket and withdrew a device that looked like a standard department-issued smartphone, despite Miller's pockets being emptied by security protocols before he entered the room. A violent, rhythmic vibration rattled the interrogation table, the steel surface groaning under the unseen force of the signal. Miller's confiscated phone, lying on the desk, lit up with a blinding blue notification that pulsed in time with the room's sudden, erratic electrical spikes. The reflection in the mirror was typing rapidly on its own device, illuminated by the cold, digital glare of a screen that shouldn't exist in this dimension. The message on the screen was short, a single terrifying command: do not look. It was a directive from a future that hadn't happened yet, etched into the reality of the room. Miller's fingers hovered over the device, his knuckles turning white as he fought the urge to read the notification, his skin weeping a fine, cold sweat. He began to whisper, a frantic, incoherent stream of denial, as the reflection watched him with a wide, unnatural grin that defied the biology of a human face. I pounded on the observation glass, my shouts trapped behind the soundproof pane. But Miller was lost in the feedback loop, his mind unraveling in the presence of the mirror entity. Miller swiped the screen, and the temperature in the room plummeted, the air turning into a biting chemical frost that stung the lungs. The observation glass spiderwebbed with frost, the ice crystals growing in geometric patterns that mirrored the room's architecture, as if the building itself were trying to seal the breach. The reflection didn't just smile, it laughed, a silent, mocking vibration that shook the very foundation of the building, rattling the light fixtures until they shattered. He hit the delete icon, but the lights died, replaced by the harsh, strobing red of emergency power. The reflection remained illuminated in cold, fluorescent white, unbothered by the darkness, as if it existed in a different light spectrum entirely. It pressed its palms against the inside of the glass, its fingers elongating and pressing through the surface like needles piercing through skin. The mirror surface rippled like standing water, the mercury-like substance swallowing the light of the room. The reflection grabbed Miller by the wrists, pulling him toward the glass with a sickening crunch of bone that resonated through the intercom. Miller planted his feet, screaming as he was dragged into the two-dimensional plane, his body folding into the mirror's surface like paper being crumpled. The thermal feed tore apart, corrupted by digital artifacting, as Miller's body heat bled into the mirror's cold, dead surface. The heat signatures of Miller and the reflection merged into a single, dense mass of boiling red, an impossible violation of volume that forced the system's logic processors to overheat. The camera recorded the transition with a high-pitched whine, the data stream dissolving into pure noise. The system logged a catastrophic logic error, non-Euclidean coordinate convergence, indicating a breach in the 13.08 Hz harmonic stability. An analysis of the raw telemetry shows Miller's mass displacement vector aligning perfectly with the structural grid of the mirror's frame. This convergence suggests the mirror is not a reflection, but a conduit for the 13th node's data stream, bypassing standard reality filters. The thermal feed degraded into a storm of gray pixels, the data stream losing its coherence as Miller's signature was stretched into a vertical line, folded into the architecture of the mirror itself. The room fell silent. The only sound the hum of failing servers and the distant rhythmic ticking of a clock that no longer corresponded to the room's time. The silence was absolute, a heavy, oppressive blanket that suggested the room had been excised from the local timeline. The response team breached the room to find it empty, the air still vibrating with the lingering aftershocks of the spatial displacement. The chair was overturned, and the phone sat on the table, untouched, its screen dark and cold. There was no sign of Miller, no blood, and no breach in the mirror's integrity, as if the room had been reset by the system to conceal the error. I walked up to the glass, my breath hitching as I saw it. The reflection showed the empty room, but the lighting was wrong, preserved from a time that had already been deleted. The mirror displayed a perfectly preserved recording of a room that no longer existed, a ghost of the past trapped behind the silver backing. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I approached the cold, flat surface. I pressed my hand against the solid surface, feeling the unnatural chill radiating from the glass. As I pulled away, I saw it, a bloody fingerprint pressed against the glass from the inside. It was a side that was supposed to be solid concrete, a physical impossibility that proved Miller hadn't just disappeared. He had been folded into the architecture of the building. We sealed the room and disconnected the feeds, the silence of the facility becoming a physical weight. The official report states Miller absconded, but the forensic analysis of the phone recovered a deleted message from the cache. It was sent from a terminal inside the building, dated 12 years in the future, with a single command for Miller: execute the purge of the 13th node. The police interrogation room was only 2 steps wide on the inside, but it stretched for 50 miles in the dark. It started as a routine internal review of Precinct 44's overnight logs, a simple check of the digital records. A suspect had been placed in Room B, but when the morning shift arrived, the chair was empty. The initial assumption was a simple hardware fault in the precinct's aging surveillance system, a ghost in the machine that the desk sergeant dismissed with a tired wave. Audio intercepts from the dispatch frequency reveal the exact moment Officer Miller entered to investigate. Dispatch, this is Miller. The suspect is gone, but the camera must be throwing a shadow. The back wall looks completely blacked out. Dispatch responded with standard protocol, advising him to check the light fixture. They believed it was just a blown bulb, casting an optical illusion. The transcript shows Miller's growing frustration as he stepped further inside. Negative, dispatch. The bulb is fine. My flashlight beam isn't hitting the drywall. It's just continuing. He took 3 steps forward, which should have put him pressed flat against the acoustic tiling. Instead, the camera captured his silhouette shrinking, as if he were walking down a long, unlit tunnel. Dispatch attempted to rationalize the visual data. Miller, stop messing around. It's a 10 by 10 box. Just reach out and touch the wall. There was a long pause on the radio. When Miller finally keyed his mic, his breathing was heavy. I've been walking straight for 4 minutes. The floor is still linoleum, but the air is freezing. There is no wall. The analyst logs from the Archive 13 Topology Division indicate a total loss of spatial integrity. Internal sensors confirmed the precinct's geometry began to fold, effectively removing the room from the building's physical footprint. The void wasn't just empty space. It was a hungry, non-Euclidean vacuum, consuming the very concept of the precinct's architecture. Every sensor we deployed returned a reading of null, as if the room had never been constructed at all. The captain authorized the emergency thermal radar array. The scan defied every known metric of architecture. Miller's heat signature registered as 3.2 miles away, still moving. But the beam of his flashlight did something worse. It began to reflect off the empty air, creating a shimmering, iridescent distortion that shouldn't exist in a vacuum. The anomaly was now manifesting physical properties where there was no matter to support them. Miller's voice cracked over the radio. Dispatch, I'm dropping a flare. Tell me if you see it. The thermal camera in the room flared white for a fraction of a second, but the sound of the flare igniting didn't reach the dispatch microphone until 14 seconds later. The acoustic delay proved the space was physically expanding around him, stretching the very laws of propagation. It was at this exact moment that local dispatch lost control of the frequency. A high-pitched tone overrode the precinct's communications. An automated voice began broadcasting on all channels. This frequency has been seized by the Archive 13 Topology Division. All local units are ordered to stand down. Do not enter Room B. The scale of the incident had triggered automated watchdogs. Archive analysts immediately began pinging Miller's radio, not to rescue him, but to map the spatial distortion. Officer Miller, this is Control. Describe your surroundings. Miller's response was barely audible over the growing electromagnetic hum. It's just the room. The table, the mirror, the chair, but they're repeating. I've walked past the same metal chair 400 times. The telemetry data logged by the Topology Division was terrifyingly consistent. Every iteration of the chair Miller passed contained a microscopic deviation in its atomic structure, suggesting the anomaly was actively rewriting matter with every repetition. Analysts noted that the chair was slowly losing its physical cohesion, turning into a dense, non-reactive sludge of pure information. This was no longer just a spatial loop. It was a systematic deconstruction of the local reality layer. The visual feeds from Precinct 44 completely collapsed, replaced by Archive 13's proprietary telemetry interface. The topology division didn't send a retrieval team. They understood that entering the anomaly would only add mass to the spatial loop. Instead, they simply recorded the data as Miller continued to walk. By hour 3, his signal was registering at a depth of 47 miles. Miller's breathing had slowed. The panic in his voice had been replaced by a hollow, vacant exhaustion. Control. The linoleum is gone. It's dirt now, but the fluorescent lights are still up there, in the dark, just hanging in the sky. The analysts noted the environmental shift. The room was no longer just stretching. It was beginning to assimilate external geography. At hour 5, the telemetry showed Miller stopping. The distance tracker locked at exactly 50 miles from the precinct door. The analysts waited, fingers hovering over their consoles, expecting the signal to finally die. Instead, the radio clicked on one last time. The audio was crystal clear, completely devoid of the static that had plagued the last 50 miles. Control, Miller whispered, his voice echoing as if he were standing in a massive cathedral. I found the back wall, but the suspect isn't here. The analysts checked the camera feed of the interrogation room, which still showed a 10 by 10 box, empty and silent. The physical reality of the precinct remained entirely undisturbed. The lead analyst pressed the talk button. Copy that, Miller. What is your current status? What do you see at the wall? The radio hissed softly. The topology division didn't attempt to send a recovery team. They just logged the final transmission, sealing the file. They never lose. They just document. Miller's final words were recorded at 0400 hours. There's a door in the drywall. It's locked from the outside. The brass plate on the front. It says room 1308. It's not a precinct anymore. It's a mirror of the archive itself. The precinct was evacuated the next day. The room was sealed, quietly acquired by the archive, and left to sit in the dark, a silent testament to the fact that the archive's own headquarters might be a recursive loop we haven't mapped yet.